For our art piece, we have produced ink-painted sketches of the cerebellum from different anatomical viewpoints. Important neuroanatomical structures have been highlighted in golden ink. The structures of the cerebellum are mirrored on both hemispheres, similar to an ink blot painting, which we were inspired by. The first ink painting highlights the cerebellum, sitting inferior to the cerebrum. The resemblance in shape to the cerebrum is evident, which inspired the colloquial term little brain, but we can also distinguish it by its shallow groove texture as opposed to the gyri and sulci of the cerebral hemispheres. We can see here the cerebellum is also dorsal to the brainstem, through which it is connected by peduncles, dense bundles of nerve fibers. The pons mediate signals between the cerebrum and the cerebellum by providing a bridge of white matter. The second ink painting demonstrates a superior view of the cerebellum, still attached to the brainstem. In this image, we have highlighted the vermis. It is a thin medial strip. We can see it separates our two cerebellar hemispheres. The vermis and the hemispheres are composed of multiple lobules, but there are three functional divisions: the vestibulocerebellum, cerebrocerebellum, and spinocerebellum. The vermis is the termination point of spinocerebellar pathways carrying proprioceptive information.
This drawing depicts the inferior view of the cerebellar tonsil. This piece of neuroanatomy is a group of lobules stemming from the inferior cerebellum. Continuous laterally with the posterior lobe, the tonsils coordinate the voluntary movement undergone by distal limb sections. These distal parts include the hands and feet, with movements such as walking, kicking, grabbing, and tensing, all under the domain of the cerebellar tonsils. The arbor vitae is a collection of white matter providing sensory and motor input and output to the cerebellum. The white matter fibers send neuronal signals to and from the brain for stimuli detection and for bodily movements. The arbor vitae stems to many areas of the cerebellum and is present
In our fifth ink painting, we have shown a posterior view of the cerebellum, prominently featuring the posterior lobe. It is the largest of the three anatomical lobes we can divide the cerebellum into. It receives input primarily from the parietal lobe of the cerebral cortex and provides output to the ventrolateral thalamus and the motor cortex in order to coordinate fine motor skills and plan voluntary movements.
The anterior lobe of the cerebellum aids in fine motor control of body movements. The spinal cord plays a big role in the messages sent to the lobe. The dorsal column and trigeminal nerve deliver information to the anterior lobe, with visual and auditory systems further providing sensory input information. Fibers located deep within the lobe, the cerebellar nuclei, then send this information to the cerebral cortex and to the brainstem. The peduncles are an important part of the cerebellum as they connect the cerebellum to the rest of the nervous system. Fibers descend through the cerebellum into the brainstem and spinal cord. The afferent and efferent pathways extend through these fibers, and all three peduncles, superior, middle, and inferior, ensuring information from the brainstem can be properly processed. The superior peduncle connects the midbrain to the cerebellum through white matter tracts. The middle peduncle connects the pons to the cerebellum, while the inferior peduncle connects the medulla oblongata to the cerebellum. The cerebellar flocculus is located within the peduncles, posterior of the middle peduncle. The primary function of the flocculus is to aid in motor control, primarily head rotation. Heavily associated with the vermis nodule, information from the ear and vestibular system allows the flocculus to aid in balance. The brainstem is the pathway for motor and sensory information to be transported to the cerebellum. The brainstem is connected to the cerebellum through the three peduncles, all of which stem to different areas of the brain. This allows the cerebellum to send information to and from the brain from various connections, ensuring that all information can be properly processed. The brainstem further connects the cerebellum to the spinal cord. Without the brainstem connection, breathing, consistent heart rate, blood pressure, and consciousness would not be possible.
The cerebellum is a crucial structure of the hindbrain, along with the pons, reticular formation, and medulla. These structures play an important role in controlling motor functions. which includes both voluntary and involuntary functions, such as breathing, balance, and complex movements. The size of the cerebellum correlates to the types of movements that a species is capable of. For example, the human brain has a relatively large cerebellum in relation to the rest of the brain because it is involved in intricate movements and cognitive functions. On the other hand, a sloth which moves slowly has a relatively small cerebellum in relation to overall brain size. Over the years, there has been a shift in knowledge about the function and role of the cerebellum, as previously the function was mostly associated with motor control. Research suggests that the right hemisphere is pivotal in cognitive function, which includes modulating both language and cognition. The cerebellum is able to function in these ways through cerebral networks. A large number of neurons allows the cerebellum to respond quickly to the information received. Furthermore, there are extensive neural connections between the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex. For instance, information processing between the cerebellum and the contralateral cerebrum involves two key pathways. One, the input channel where information travels from the pons to the cerebellum, and two, the output channel travels from the cerebellum through to the cerebral nuclei, thalamus, and then to the cerebral cortex.
How does damage to the cerebellum impact on function? Although an individual can survive without components of their cerebellum, having an intact cerebellum allows one to extend and hone motor behaviours. When it is damaged, foremostly we see a decomposition of movement. It is important to note that any signs of damage to a cerebellum will manifest on the ipsilateral side of the body, the same side as the damaged hemisphere. As the cerebellar lobes each have different roles mediated by their input and output connections, lesions in each of these areas will impact on function in different ways. Following damage to the vestibulocerebellum, being the lobe closely linked to the vestibular system, a patient may have difficulty balancing, maintaining an upright posture, or fixating on a target. Damage to the regulatory connection with the vestibular system can also cause hypotonia. If a patient has a lesion in the spinocerebellum, which receives primary sensory signals from the body and is linked to the spinal cord, they may be unable to perform fast, alternating movements, known as dysdiadochonesia. They may demonstrate dysmetria, movements with imprecise timing, force, and range, likely accompanied by an intention tremor. Furthermore, a patient may walk with a wide-based, staggering gait. These symptoms represent a disruption to the cerebellar mechanisms for receiving sensory feedback and making error corrections. A healthy cerebellum would typically be able to monitor the execution of these movements based on feedback from muscles, tendons, and joints, and then influence subsequent cortical motor output, which is why damage can cause ataxia, uncoordinated and inaccurate movement. If a patient has a lesion in the cerebrocerebellum, which is highly connected to the motor cortex involved in motor planning and motor learning, they may experience reduced fine motor control and struggle to execute intricate learned movements, such as playing a musical instrument. Finally, because the cerebellar control circuit also has an important feed-forward role in the speech-motor system, particularly in motor programming, speech production can also be impacted by cerebellar damage. This is known as ataxic dysarthria, where all levels of speech reflect a breakdown of timing and coordination, but particularly prosody and articulation. Speech sounds slower and more monotone with irregular volume shifts, pauses, and speech movements.
Damage to the cerebellum results in loss of balance, movement, and coordination. A major condition associated with cerebellar damage is ataxia. When ataxia occurs, it occurs in the midline of the cerebellum. Ataxia occurs when the cerebellum is damaged, with the most common causes being alcohol-induced, infections, or post-infectious diseases. This condition leads to impaired muscle coordination, poor balance, which impacts walking and is also known as gait ataxia, and loss of coordination to the eyes. This dysfunction can further lead to cognitive dysmetria. Cognitive dysmetria occurs due to demyelinating axons, degenerative disorders, and brain trauma such as tumors or concussions. Dysmetria is a disability causing issues with judgment of distance and speed, creating lack of coordination. Dysmetria also prohibits range of motion, impacting the individual's ability to correctly proceed with smooth movement. Brain trauma, such as stroke, can cause cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome, also known as CCAS. The stroke causes lesions in the anterior lobe of the cerebellum, affecting language processing, body regulation, and further causing ataxia. Strokes that impact the superior cerebellar artery also cause limb dysmetria and walking ataxia. Overall, damage to the cerebellum primarily impacts balance and functional movement and can be caused through trauma to the brain or excessive alcohol consumption. This assessment was divided into 3 main sections. The first section was discussing a piece of neuroanatomy or neurological system. This first point of research was assigned to Shireen. The second component was discussing how damage to this piece of neuroanatomy impacts function. This component was completed by Mosaia. The final section was discussing conditions associated with damage to this piece of anatomy, undertaken by Kennedy. Our creative piece was a series of drawings which Mosaia created. When it came time to recording, Mosaia created speeches and audio for Part A, describing the artwork, images 1, the cerebellum, 2, the vermis, and 5, the posterior lobe of the cerebellum. Kennedy created speeches and audio for images 3, the cerebellar tonsil, 4, the arbor vitae, 6, the anterior lobe of the cerebellum, 7, the peduncles, 8, the folliculus, 9, the brainstem, and the discussion of each person's contribution. During the editing portion of the video, Mosaia collated all the recordings done by herself and Kennedy and put them in a video with the ink drawings in the background. Kennedy then finalized the reference list for the assignment.